faithful few, and welcome to this installment of your award-winning Wham City Lecture Series. This evening, as we eke into the season of creeps, we've scheduled 2 lectures, which are going to horrify and upset you, which I assume is why nobody came. First, we will be talking about what should be, it is arguably arguable, one of the most terrible things that's happened here in America, Hurricane Katrina. Granted, Muslims did not send this to attack us. It was God himself who struck us down on this occasion.
I don't know, Michelle Bachman might think differently, but go
Well, compounded by the God that we all have to bow down to here in America, the American government. And we have the special treat to have access to someone who was on the inside, a whistleblower, our Baltimore's own and the Yellow Sign Theater's own, fabulous Lori.
Thank you. So I'm Lori Travis, and disclaimer, not an economist, but I was, a person that worked on the inside. We'll get to that in a little bit, but this is about Hurricane Katrina and my very small, minute role, which actually affected my life incredibly. So, August 29th, 2005. Does anybody know 1836, what that number signifies at all? It's the number of people who died in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. And the quote below it is by one Milton Friedman, who says, "Only a crisis, actual or perceived, produces real change. When that crisis occurs, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around. That, I believe, is our basic function, to develop alternatives to existing policies, to keep them alive and available until the politically impossible becomes politically inevitable." What does that mean? I mean, it sounds like, a crisis happens, and what do people do in a crisis? They panic, they freak out, they have no idea what to do. And if anybody remembers what happened during Hurricane Katrina, everybody freaked out. But Hurricane Katrina was about 8 years ago, so it's very far in our minds right now. Nobody really knows what those feelings were. They can only just say, it was a memory. So I really don't know. But who the hell is this Milton Friedman anyway? He was a recipient of the 1976 Nobel Prize for Economic Science. He was a senior researcher, blah, blah, blah. Y'all can read it. The finer points of Milton Friedman's existence was that he was a strong opponent of Keynesian economics, which is, the New Deal, everything that was social programs to ensure the safety of the American people, except he was a European. He was pretty good friends with a lot of South American dictators. Google Augusto Pinochet and Milton Friedman, you'll see some things that'll make your skin crawl. However, he did actually have a good point on legalization of drugs. He was a libertarian on that front. He did advocate the legalization of drugs. And prostitution. He said it was a good economic venture. I gotta agree with the dude. Like, hey, man. So my opinion of him is he's not an evil guy. He's just a little misguided on several concepts of human decency. We'll get to that in a bit. Okay, the hell is disaster capitalism? All right, the term was coined in 2007 by Naomi Klein, by her book, The Shock Doctrine, and it basically outlined several attempts to shock an economy into radically changing their economic policies. Most of the policies that were in place were socialism. Nobody likes isms, but I'm going to say it. Socialism, so they had a lot of policies in place that helped the working class. And most of the policies are put into place after severe economic policies, after major disasters brought on by war, economic or political collapse, or natural disaster. Here's some examples. In her book, there was Chile in 1975, and that was a political collapse, and that was Augusto Pinochet and Milton Friedman and his Chicago School of Economics actually coined, like they didn't coin it, they researched papers and wrote papers on policies that were put in place by Pinochet himself. Milton Friedman claims until the day he died that he didn't really know that he was going to kill millions of people. That's another thing. And of course there was the Russia in 1991 after the collapse of Russia. There was that, and there was a lot of economic policies, and it became an oligarchy, which is what it is now today. And the Iraq War of 2003 to 2010, and of course what we're going to discuss tonight, Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans in 2005, which is happening here on our own turf. The basic principles of disaster economics. Does anybody know, first of all, what that is? What is disaster economics? What is disaster capitalism? What is it? Anybody? Anybody? Bueller? All right. What it is basically the existing policies that are in place. It takes people to just like kind of not pay attention, and the politicians and the lobbyists get together and they're like, hey, this is a really good time to do this. Look at that. And they really, really hope that nobody notices. And most people don't. But who does it benefit? You know, who benefits from these policies? Who are the ones that actually, you know, benefit? My whole thing was follow the money. And there is a lot of it. And believe me. All right, so what does this have to do with me? All right, well, good question. All right, so there's a representative, 10-term Republican from Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And the Wall Street Journal reported yesterday that he was overheard telling the lobbyists, we finally cleaned up that public housing in New Orleans. We couldn't do it, but God did. What the ever-loving fuck did that guy just say? Seriously, what the ever-loving fuck did he just say? Yeah, he said that, and I'm going to translate this for anybody who cares to know. He said that the public housing in New Orleans was something that was terrible. But the storm came in and cleaned it up. How'd they clean it up? Well, there were dead bodies floating in water. That's how they cleaned it up. Or that's how he viewed it as they cleaned it up. All right? What does that have to do with me? This is, you know, obviously this is super dope after Katrina. Immediately after, following the day after. Millions of people trying to get out of the city, millions of people put into a football stadium trying to get safe from a storm that ripped apart at, you know, shred. Well, folks, I was one of the lobbyists. I was in that room. I was there when he said it. I was actually in the room when he said it. Now, I was a lobbyist paralegal at a prestigious DC law firm from July 2003 to September 2005. What did I do? I did a lot of grunt work, I did a lot of research. Basically, I worked for 3 major lawyers, and they told me, you know, you have to do this, you have to do that. But my job entailed a lot of calling the Hill and, you know, talking to staffers and doing a lot of work with the staffers. And let me say, you know, I did a lot of bill writing. You know, it says, yes, I wrote bills. Anybody who thinks that congressmen writes bills, they don't. There was an actual word template for a congressional bill in our database, and we wrote them ourselves. And whatever talking points or whatever the lobbyists wanted, we put into that bill. I talked to Hill staffers a lot. I set up fundraisers. I was once a girl that stood in the corner of a room of a fundraiser. I had a purse, you know, and I carried $30,000 in it. Back to the bank, but there was a point in time when I wish I could have just ran. But I didn't. And yes, it's grunt work, and I really wanted to work in politics. I wanted to work in politics since I was in high school. I really, really did. I am that fucking crazy. Yeah, I am that fucking crazy. So I did. So let me tell you a story. This is my wedding picture. And we'll be giving a lecture next. In 2005, we were getting married, and when we were planning our wedding, we decided that we wanted to go to New Orleans for our honeymoon. And we were really excited about that because we got married on October 30th. And we were like, oh my God, this is gonna be great. We're gonna get married, and the day after we're gonna fly down to New Orleans, and it's gonna be awesome. We're gonna spend Halloween, and then a couple of days later, we're gonna spend it in New Orleans over Halloween. How great is that? It was awesome. So he's like, yeah, let's do that. And I decided, all right, I'm gonna put some money down. I found some hotels, I put some money down. I was gonna go ahead and do this. It sounded great. So I did that, and of course, August comes by. I had actually put my money down 2 weeks before Hurricane Katrina hit. And everybody in the firm that I worked for, and the firm that I worked for actually had a lot of roots in New Orleans, right, fattened hogs. So, you know, they had a lot of roots there, and they kept telling me, New Orleans always bounces back. They always bounce back. It's fine. Everything is going to be just fine. They're going to clean up. Everything's going to be great. And you should be able to go down to your honeymoon, no problems. So I said, all right, this is the 28th of August. 29th, the next day, I come to work. It's a Tuesday, because it hit on a Monday. It's a Tuesday, and I'm watching all of the newsreels. Now, my primary job function at the law firm was I'd come into work, I would get my coffee, and I would pull all of the major news outlets that happened that day for my boss and anything that was pertinent to any of the clients that I represented. So it was extremely important that I get the most, current up-to-date news to make sure that any of the clients that we represented at the firm was going to, if there's anything that happened that we didn't know about, we were going to be covered. All right, so I get in and it's a disaster. There's people fleeing all over the place. The levees had broke, the Ninth Ward was flooded. I mean, the entire city was underwater. Nobody knew what was going on. There was absolute anarchy and chaos. And we're watching this on television in Washington, D.C. And I'm just sitting there going, oh my gosh, my entire honeymoon just got flooded. They're never going to bounce back from this. This is going to be horrible. So I'm sitting there in the firm, and of course my boss comes in, and he's always late. I was early. I got there at 8:30. He got there at 10:30. That's what lawyers do. They get there at 10:30. Paralegals get there at 8:30 to do all the work. So he gets there, and he's like, oh, I got calls last night. You gotta do this. You gotta do this. You gotta do this. And I'm like, oh, okay. So within 24 hours of the hurricane hitting, 24 hours, we had retained the business of about 5 major corporations, healthcare corporations that were willing to seek representation on Capitol Hill for the further privatization of public hospitals, other corporations that were seeking to clean up the disaster, other corporations that were also seeking to help with the disaster cleanup and everything like that, and they were seeking representation with our firm. Our firm had a lot of roots in New Orleans. Of course, they're going to seek representation with somebody who actually knew what was going on and had a vested interest. Well, what kind of vested interest did this firm really have? So I'm sitting there, and weeks are going by, and I'm reading all of these contracts, and I'm seeing what the end game was. And I actually realized that none of these corporations had the best interests of the people who were the most affected by this storm. They didn't give a shit about them. All they cared about was the sheer fact that they got representation to get their piece of the pie. So I'm in a room, and they had what we called war rooms, and there's stacks and stacks of papers, and there's paralegals all over the place, and lawyers were coming in and out, and we were going through all kinds of bills in Congress, and we were redlining stuff, and we're doing all this stuff, and I sit there, and I'm sitting across from the room from my coworker, and I said, you know what? I quit. And the reason I quit, and the reason I wanted to quit was because I really could not stand to sit there and watch this beloved city of New Orleans be fucked by these corporations that wanted to take over all of the things that this community had taken generations to build. Generations to build. And I was actually sitting there watching this happen. Now this might sound like tinfoil hat stuff. This might sound like, oh my God, you gotta be out of your goddamn mind. No, it actually really did occur. And I was like, all right, I quit. My coworker says, you quit every week. No, I quit. So then there was the meeting that occurred. We were in with my lawyer, and I'm sitting there and I'm taking notes. And with congressman representatives, and that is where I heard the quote. Well, I guess we couldn't clean up public housing, and God did. And are you fucking serious? I went right back to my desk immediately after that happened, and I handed in a 2 weeks notice. I did not have a job lined up. I had a job that I hope I had, but I said, you know what, I quit. Couldn't do it anymore. And you know, there's all these people that are trying to just make a difference. The Red Cross, things like that, humanitarian efforts, but they didn't have enough money to do it. Corporations had a lot more money, a lot more. So I left. And so yeah. After that, here's a chicken with some, chicken with some flip-flops, because chickens and flip-flops are funny. But what did happen after I left? Well, the term disaster capitalism wasn't actually coined until 2007. I didn't really actually have no idea what was happening when I was watching it all go down. I had no clue. And I was just, reacting to these forces that were occurring, and I was, sitting there. One of the things that I did, here's a good point. One of the things that actually did happen was I came into the morning, and I actually sit there and I had to say, hey, there was a letter from the Committee of Government Oversight, Government Reform and Oversight. They're actually trying to get some energy up in Congress, and they're trying desperately to stop waste and fraud over Katrina. Well, my boss took that letter out of my hand, he grabbed it, and he said, this is a disaster, what are we gonna do? Oh my gosh, they can't stop us from representing all of the people who want to rape the city of New Orleans. He didn't actually say that, but that's what I heard, and that's why I left. So what did happen after that? I was there while it was going down, and what actually did happen after that? Well, here's some experiments in disaster capitalism. The tenets of disaster capitalism is that you have a crisis, you have something that's really horrible that's happening, nobody's paying attention, everybody is paying attention to the disaster at hand, but nobody is paying attention to what's going on behind the screen. You know what? Pay no attention to the man behind the curtain. Nobody is paying attention to that man. Could be a whole bunch of lobbyists pulling a lot of strings, and believe me, they do. They pull a lot of strings. So, what was actually happening? Well, there was a push for privatization in all the public tenants of the city of New Orleans. One of the major things was Milton Friedman, in December of 2005, wrote one of his last op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, advocating the takeover and privatization of New Orleans public schools. Yes, they were failing. Yes, they were poorly run. None of the teachers had any of the stuff that they needed to teach the children. The op-ed was called The Promise of Vouchers. Everybody's heard vouchers. Anybody know about vouchers? Do they know what they are? Okay. Vouchers is very unpopular. It has never actually passed in any municipality that I know of to this day, because there has been a lot of progressive backlash to it, because it disproportionately favors the people who are in the upper echelons of society. So his quote was, most of New Orleans schools are in ruins, are the homes and the children who have attended them. The children are now scattered all over the country. This is a tragedy, an opportunity to radically reform the system. Radically reform the system? Well, how are you going to do that? Voucher systems were unpopular. They were unpopular at the time. But what was popular? Is anybody familiar with charter schools?
Yes.
Okay, progressive idea, really awesome idea that the community gets together. The entire community has a vested interest in their school operating in a way that teaches their children effectively. So who is actually policing these school systems? You, the parents. The parents have a direct say in what the kids do. They have a direct say on the teachers, they have a direct say on the principal, they have a direct say on the curriculum. They have to meet a basic standard of education set by the government. But they have a community of people who care about their children, who are really, really, really going to work hard to make sure that that charter school works. All right, sounds like a great fucking idea. Well, they turned most of the schools in New Orleans into charter schools, except most are controlled in for-profit interests. They're not controlled by the community. Most have strict entrance guidelines. For instance, I was reading an article that stated that the entrance guidelines to most of the charter schools that this experiment, and they are now coming in with the results 8 years later, the most disaffected students, they couldn't even get past the application process, let alone try to get entrance into the school. Some are religious-based, parochial schools. Okay, that's to each his own. Some teach the tenets of Six Sigma to motivate students to learn. Well, if you get a for-profit interest, and I'm dead serious, I am dead serious, there are schools out there that are teaching the tenets of Six Sigma to motivate students to learn. They have a no excuses policy. They really, really, really want this to work. Well, all right. And they have a, and of course they have a rigorous application and selection process. Now they're getting government grants. You're not, going to pay for it out of pocket. These are still considered public schools. All right. Well, that's great. It sounds like a great idea. Of course it does. If you're not the following. In need of special education, you come from a poor household with little resources, labeled a problem child that consistently scores low on tests, or will eventually need money to attend college of your choice. That's a lecture for another day. However, these charter schools that they put into place, especially the ones that are run by the for-profits, they decided that they're going to teach the test. No Child Left Behind was something that was put into place by George W. Bush. He decided that he was going to say, hey man, this is going to be great. We're going to reform the educational system, and we're going to allow for-profits to come in and help us. The market's going to decide. How can you let the market decide something that doesn't fit everybody? Let me ask you a question. Y'all went to high school, I'm assuming. Everybody did, all right? How many, raise your hand, show of hands, went to a public high school? How many went to a private one? Okay. What were the differences? Anybody? Good? Do you know? I went to both. I'm going to tell you, I went to a private and a public high school. 2. I went to a parochial high school, and I promised I would never send a daughter of mine to any parochial high school, except I did. That's a story for another day. But I went to a public high school. I will say this, the public high schools, at the time, they cared, but they cared only enough to, get you through to graduation. They didn't really give a shit about me. And the private high school, I got into trouble a hell of a lot more than I did. Why? They had a vested interest. They had donors. They had parents who were paying. They had a community who's policing them. But why would a for-profit care? What does a for-profit have to care? They don't have a community interest. The parents don't care. What's their vested interest? Their vested interest in making sure and maintaining the status quo is that, just like a corporation, you are beholden to your shareholders. So if a school is run like a corporation, you're beholden to your, wait for it, not legendary, but you're beholden to your grant writers. You're beholden to the grants that you receive from the federal government, and those are contingent on test scores. So what are you going to do? Well, how about, say, 65% of your student body is performing below level? You're actually going to fudge the numbers, right? What are you going to do? How are you going to do that? Well,
Come out.
exactly. So what does the charter school system do in New Orleans now? What does it do? It actually creates a two-tier system. So here is the top, the charter schools, the for-profit charter schools that are running in New Orleans. And then they've got another echelon of schools that run for the students that can't get into these charter schools because they can't test at that level. So you have here, we have all these students here, they perform really highly on all these tests. Then the rest of them, they can go over there, across the tracks. Nobody cares about them. All right, so that's just an example. Now here, that the experiment started in 2005, immediately after Katrina, and immediately after all that hit. And I was there representing some of the corporations that did indeed want to take over the public school system in New Orleans, also the public health system. Both experiments are exactly the way that the lobbyists and the disaster capitalists intended. Most of the public schools in New Orleans are now charter schools, except for a few, and almost all of the hospitals in the area are now privately run. What does that mean for the most disaffected people in the city of New Orleans? Well, it means that there's no longer, for instance, this actually ties into the educational thing. There was an article written in Newsweek about a student who went to one of the charter schools, and he needed a lot of help. He needed some help on, he needed special ed help. He needed rehabilitation help because he was shot. He was in the line of fire. He needed a lot of help, but there was no resources for him whatsoever because almost all the public hospitals had been converted to private hospitals. So mental health and rehabilitation for teens were no longer available. And I was there in that room, working on the contracts for those private organizations to take over the hospitals. And anybody who thinks this is tinfoil hat stuff, no, it really is for real. So does anybody think that this is still happening today? Do you think that there is a disaster that needs to happen or a natural disaster that needs to happen? How many think a natural disaster needs to happen for these policies to be put in place? Does anybody know? Anybody think that a natural disaster needs to occur? Absolutely not. Is this still happening? Yes, it is. It is happening right now. All right, so I'm going to read this quote here. On January 18th, 4 current and former chairmen of the Republican Study Committee announced an agreement to resequence the 2013 fiscal fights. In exchange for holding the line on the sequester, producing a budget that balanced in 10 years, conservatives agreed to postpone the debt ceiling debate for several months. In turn, the debate on the debt ceiling would revolve around enacting the policies to put the federal budget on a path to 10-year balance. And that was an open letter to Congress written by Michael Needham, the Chief Executive Officer for Heritage Action for America. Who is Heritage Action for America? Anybody know? You do? All right, who are they?
Well, they're a multifaceted organization that lobbies for pretty different and extreme levels of the conservative agenda.
Exactly. They are a Koch brothers funded organization that lobbies heavily for through the Tea Party and grassroots organization. And I say grassroots with quotes because grassroots in the Tea Party is a fallacy.
Yes.
Total fallacy. This actual fight that's occurring right now, this fight that we're seeing that may have, everybody in this room probably knows somebody or a friend or a family member who is currently furloughed or affected by the government shutdown. Even my daughter, who can't get the census data for her college paper, is affected by the shutdown. lobbyists are pulling the strings. Lobbyists are the ones that are doing all of the work. They are strong-arming one side of the Republican Party into bowing down to another extremely hardline right side to the other. And this is an interesting fight because, as I was talking earlier, I said it is really interesting as somebody who grew up in the Cold War era to hear the word hardliners as described in our government. When I heard the word hardliners when I was younger, I heard hardliners. It was always to describe the hardline communists that were holding the government hostage in Poland, in Russia, in all of the Iron Curtain states that existed before probably a large majority of you were born. But I remember that, but now we're experiencing our own hardliners in the American government. So now you're thinking, okay, so I found this on the internet. It's all out in the open. Yeah, of course it's out in the open. They want you to see what they're doing. They have no secret agenda. This is not a tinfoil hat thing. This is all written down. So this letter was written in response to what was called the Williamsburg Accord. The Williamsburg Accord was a caucus of Tea Party members and a couple of other former Congress critters who went down to Williamsburg and they decided to get together and they were going to write a plan to budget the economy based in austerity. Austerity being, does anybody know? Anybody? Bueller?
Shutting down public services.
Pretty much. Everybody, austerity is basically cutting all budgetary, non-essential budgetary items in any given state. It could be Europe, which is experiencing it right now, or it could be the United States, which is also experiencing it right now.